We live in a world our ancestors would barely recognize. Around the globe, the impact of human ingenuity is now everywhere. We push back the limits of our planet at speeds, depths, and heights that would have left our forebears breathless. Driving all these achievements is humankind's extraordinary gift for invention. Through genius and inspiration, we created exceptional solutions to complex problems, from the everyday to the spectacular, some good and some not so good. This series celebrates the million ways our great inventions have transformed our world.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This invention has been shaping our world for the past 10,000 years and longer. It's enabled Europeans to embark on their journeys of discovery, and since ancient times, it has spurred the growth of trade.
Hardly any other invention has shaped people's daily lives across the globe over such a long time.
Women inspired its character and were involved in its production as early as the Middle Ages, and its medicinal properties were lauded by some scholars of that time.
It in fact contains many healthy ingredients.
It also transformed our monetary system and became a catalyst for the invention of cooling technology. But above all, it brings people together.
It's association with friendship, with fun.
We are talking about beer. You'll find countless types of beer across the globe. Englishmen love their ale. In the United States and large parts of Asia, light lager is the beer of choice. Czechs prefer Pilsner beer, which is also light but more bitter than lager. Wheat beer is popular in southern Germany. But for all the differences, there is one thing that beer has in common throughout the world. It connects people. We drink it at family gatherings, with colleagues at the end of a workday, with friends at a party, or even with strangers in a pub.
That, of course, I associate having beers with going to the pub, with doing exactly what you're meant to do, which is to go and order a pint in some pub somewhere and with friends.
It's association with friendship, with fun, with summertime, with community. I think all those things make it so appealing.
Beer has been crafted using the same principle for thousands of years. Brewing is an elaborate and time-consuming process, but the list of ingredients is straightforward.
Basically, all it takes is water, malt, hop and yeast. This is the malt we use. It's a bit like the paint box of brewing, and obviously it also influences the taste.
Nowadays, most breweries already purchase malted grain. To produce it, the grains are steeped in water, which causes them to swell in volume. The grains are allowed to germinate, and subsequently they're dried. In warm climates, the sun performs this task. In colder ones, an oven. Such light roasting produces sugar. The malt is then milled and boiled in plenty of water. A mash is thus produced. A cloudy, porridge-like mixture. The wort is obtained by filtering the mash. Hops is then added. The variety used determines to a great extent the beer's taste. In a last step, yeast is added to the beer. It converts the malt sugar into alcohol and carries out the fermentation, which takes a few days. Yeast is also what produces the carbonic acid that settles as foam atop a beer. The basic principle of brewing beer has barely changed over the centuries, but who was the first person to come up with the idea?
It's hard to say exactly who invented beer. It's kind of like the wheel, a groundbreaking invention, profoundly changed the world and the daily life of people everywhere. But it's so far in the past that there's no record of its beginnings. It might well have been a purely accidental discovery.
Some scientists suggest that nature invented beer. The grain porridge exposed to the sun too long began to ferment, thus turning into the world's first beer. But this can't be verified. What we know for sure is that without the cultivation of grain, beer brewing is unthinkable. So it stands to reason that the first brewers can be found among those who gave up their nomadic way of life to settle down. It takes fertile soil to grow grain. Scientists believe that beer was independently invented in various parts of the world where these favorable conditions were in place. In the sub-Saharan zone of southern Africa, in China and Japan, in the South American Andes, and in the Near East. The first civilization to execute beer brewing to perfection were the Sumerians of what is now Iraq and Syria. They already brewed 9 different varieties of beer. The ladies of the upper class were particularly fond of beer from Emma, which was sweetened with honey. Broader swathes of the population drank basic thin beer.
German scientists tried to brew the Sumerian beer. The experiment resulted in a very cloudy beer with bits of bread in it. With today's palates, we wouldn't find this particularly tasty because the consistency alone would scare us off. And it was also very sour and left a slight but unpleasant burning sensation in the throat, a little bit as if you'd just thrown up. It's not the ideal party drink either. The alcohol content was just 1.6%. You'd have to drink a lot of it to make you dance on tables.
The world's first brewers didn't yet understand the fermentation process using unpredictable wild yeast. Today's brewers add yeast in a targeted way to regulate their beer's alcohol content.
Berries and fruits were added to the beer to make it ferment, but they could also add honey and fruit juices to add yeast to the beer, which is obviously very important. And another way of getting yeast into beer, funnily enough, is to spit in it, because saliva actually contains yeast too. Sounds disgusting, but it's actually one of the oldest methods of fermentation.
Even today, there are local Andean beers, chicha for example, where human saliva is used to supply the yeast. Or you can use another staple food that already contains yeast, bread for example. For the ancient Egyptians, bread and beer were already inseparable bedfellows. One particular burial object represents a brewery that's located right next to a bakery, from where the yeast can quickly find its way into the beer. Since beer is so popular among Egyptians, it sparks an idea with the state authorities. They introduce a beer tax to fill the state coffers. Supposedly, this tax is not about the money, but intended solely to protect the health of their subjects. And officially, the tax is targeted at preventing alcohol abuse. This idea still reverberates today in the Scandinavian countries, where alcoholic beverages are subject to extremely high taxes to limit their consumption. Beer is a source of enormous tax revenues in other countries as well, largely due to value-added tax, corporate tax, and customs duties. Beer is, after all, a huge economic factor and one of the world's most important trading goods. An estimated 2 billion hectolitres of beer were produced in 2018 alone. Next to tea and water, beer is the most widespread beverage in the world today. But in earlier times, its importance was greatly magnified because the contaminated drinking water caused outbreaks of diseases in the Middle Ages. People resorted to beer to avoid getting sick. Even children and pregnant women drank it for health reasons.
Now, obviously, nowadays, no one would give their children beer, wean your child and then move on to beer. It doesn't seem like, the best idea.
Beer's other advantage is that it's nutrient-dense and high-caloric. 1 litre covers a fifth of an average person's daily energy requirement. And beer is also filling. In Egypt, grain surpluses were used for brewing beer. Thanks to regular flooding, agricultural land of the Nile Delta was extremely fertile and high-yielding. In ancient times, this area was known as the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Romans and Greeks, however, despise beer. They are avid wine drinkers. Beer is seen as the drink of barbarians, of the Germanic and Celtic tribes from the inhospitable north. Scholars mocked these cultures mercilessly.
The Greek physician Galen of Pergamon classified beer as female, not exactly a compliment at the time, of course. And one of Aristotle's students refers to beer as cereal, which has departed from its nature and has somewhat rotted. The fermentation process was equated with decay by the Romans and Greeks. No wonder they preferred wine.
This antique criticism against beer is still in evidence today. Wine drinkers are seen as sophisticated, educated and refined, whereas beer drinkers are viewed as crude, loud and vulgar. Yet, it couldn't stop beer's triumphal march. Today in the world's #1 beer country, every Czech citizen drinks an average of 141 litres of beer per year. Wine consumption rates, on the other hand, are trending downward. Even in Italy and France, adults today only drink an average of 44 to 50 litres a year. These days, the largest quantity of beer, some 381 million hectolitres, is produced by China, followed by the United States, Brazil and Mexico. Germany, in 5th place, produces some 93.6 million litres. All the while, Germany is where the origins of the beer trade lie. Beer emerged as one of the most important goods traded by the medieval Hanseatic League. Shipping merchants of this European commercial alliance earned a pretty penny exporting the barley juice. Export, then as now, has always stimulated production. Hamburg thus becomes the brewery of the Hanseatic League. Towards the end of the 14th century, the city is producing well over 200,000 hectolitres of beer annually, an enormous amount in those days. It's no coincidence that it's mainly the seafaring nations that evolve into beer-loving nations. Disease spreads quickly on ships, which spend days or weeks on end at sea without the possibility of taking on fresh water. The solution was beer, a beverage that remains germ-free for long periods. But even beer's shelf life was limited.
And when that goes wrong, that's disastrous. So 1588, for example, if we think about the attempt by the Spanish to invade in their armada, the English set out to fight the Spanish equipped with barrel after barrel after barrel of beer. A lot of that beer had become as corrupt and had become as bad as the water they were seeking to avoid. And so it's a curious fact that bad beer seems to have killed more people than the Spanish managed to kill.
Oxygen and heat bred the bacteria that caused beer to spoil. After a few weeks, the beer was no longer drinkable, and this posed a huge problem for sailors and the provisioning of ships. Hops. That's what gives beer its aroma and imparts a slightly bitter taste to it. But above all, hops extends the shelf life of beer. One of hops' biggest proponents is Hildegard von Bingen, a nun. She recognizes its beneficial properties. With its bitterness, it keeps away a certain rottenness from the drinks and makes them longer lasting.
Hops revolutionized beer production. This new substance probably spread from Eastern Europe as a result of the so-called barbarian invasions. And with it, it was possible for the first time to brew a beer that stayed fresh for weeks, even months under ideal conditions. Of the ingredients that are in our beer today, hops was the last to be added.
Before hops was introduced, brewers seasoned their beer with all kinds of herbs. Gale, laurel, rosemary, ginger, aniseed and cherries are just some of the ingredients that went into the brewing copper. Henbane, opium poppy, wormwood and belladonna were also used to flavour beer. Their disadvantage? They are toxic. Generally, the herbs were dosed in such low concentrations that the beer drinker came to no serious harm. Drinking beer did on occasion lead to encounters with pink unicorns, paranoia about threatening shadows, or to the world simply being a little bit more colourful for a few hours. Hops, by contrast, doesn't cause such hallucinations, even though it's a member of the hemp plant family, and it costs only 1/3 of what the herbal blends cost. In 1516, the German purity law was passed to protect beer drinkers. It's still valid today. The statute limits beer brewers to using only water, barley and hops in their beers.
This is actually an extremely modern law. Today, everyone's talking about consumer protection, but this law is over 500 years old.
This law was in fact urgently needed because the beer of that time was often adulterated with various herbs. Brewers were also known to add ox gall, eggshells or fir cones to mask the sour taste of beer that had gone off. But fraudulent brewers are in fact persecuted. Beer inspectors force them to drink the spoiled beer themselves, or the bottoms of their beer kegs are smashed to spill the contents. That's where the idiom, "to knock the bottom out of the keg," comes from. Today, hops is used primarily as a flavouring agent. There are countless varieties.
There are something like 200 to 250 different varieties of hop. I can influence the aroma of a beer depending on which of these I choose. Beer can be infused with citrusy flavours or packed with the fragrance of tropical fruits such as mango or passion fruit. Or I can choose to use more traditional hop varieties that impart floral notes to create Pilsner beer or lagers. So just about anything is possible.
The taste of the hops takes its cue from the growing area. Hop cultivation is concentrated in a few areas because it only thrives in very specific climatic zones. Major growing areas are located in Germany, the Czech Republic, the United States, China, and Australia. This is where 85% of the global hop crop is harvested. Only few brewers scatter the flowers of the hop plant into the mash. In the meantime, international producers press hops into pellets, which is both practical and space-saving. What's also decisive, apart from the hops variety, is when it is added.
As a rule of thumb, the later the hop is added and the lower the temperatures, the more aroma is retained.
But despite its long storage life, beer was not the most popular beverage in late antiquity. A powerful institution blocked its spread. In 817, a cultural struggle over beer raged in Christian Europe. The church was eager to ban beer, but monks had taken a liking to it. They also wanted to indulge in beer during Lent and fought to get it classified as a healing drink. And this idea is not even particularly far-fetched.
Beer is actually an isotonic drink, so it's really healthy with loads of valuable ingredients. I mean, it can have health-promoting effects like preventing cancer or strengthening the immune system. It would be a great and healthy drink if only it weren't for the alcohol.
Beer's alcohol content is also the main argument put forth by its opponents in the 9th century. Even though alcohol is strictly forbidden during the Christian Lent period, beer enthusiasts argue that liquids do not break fasts. Beer got backing from an unlikely source, the Pope.
Legend has it that German monks sent a tasting barrel of beer to Rome. But the journey across the Alps took so long that the beer that was sort of wobbling and shaking about on the cart went sour. And when the Pope took a sip, he found it so horrible and he said, "What the hell is this? If the monks want to drink this awful stuff, then let them go ahead and punish themselves with it."
In 817, the Synode of Aachen officially classified beer as a healing drink. From this point forward, it could also be drunk during Lent. Monasteries across Europe thus became brewing centres. Even the world's oldest still operating brewery, Weihenstephan, was originally a monastery. It's located in southern Germany, near Munich. In 1040, this monastery was granted the right to brew by the city of Freising. For almost a millennium, beer has been brewed at this spot. Beer is still being brewed in other monasteries today. Belgian Trappist beer, for example. It enjoys great popularity with beer gourmets the world over. This beer's alcohol content is higher than that of other beers because it continues to ferment in the bottle. Basically, the same principle applies here as it does for champagne. By adding sugar during bottling, a second fermentation is stimulated. This gives Trappist beer a complex and varied aroma. Depending on when it's drunk, this beer can taste very different. But Belgium's beer culture is very diverse even beyond the Trappist beers. Local beer cafes often have several hundred different types of beer on offer. In a few establishments, that number climbs to 3,000 or more.
Belgians have honoured beer in a very special way. In 2016, they managed to get their beer onto UNESCO's list of intangible cultural heritage. Beer's in good company. The pizza from Italy, the rumba from Cuba, and yoga from India stand alongside the beer.
Munich's famous Oktoberfest should also be recognised as a cultural heritage, according to its head. After all, it's one of the oldest folk festivals in the world, and the biggest too. The first of its kind took place from the 12th to the 17th of October, 1810, on the occasion of the wedding of Bavarian Crown Prince Ludwig with Princess Theresa of Saxony-Hildburghausen. The local citizenry was given an opportunity to raise a toast to the newlyweds at the festival. Today, over 6 million visitors annually clink glasses at Munich's Theresienwiese with 7 million litres of beer. For the rest of the year, beer is drunk at beer gardens, pubs and restaurants. It was also common practice in the Middle Ages for breweries to be established by a new breed of professional brewers and run as public houses.
The centrality of the tavern or inn, or what we'd now call the pub, to life in the medieval and early modern city is pretty hard to exaggerate. I mean, these taverns were meeting places, they were places strangers could stay.
Inns where guests were served already existed in the Roman Empire. In Pompeii, for example, statistically there was one tavern for every 125 residents. In the 14th century, citizens of Hamburg fared even better. There, some 531 breweries served 7,000 inhabitants, one for 13 beer drinkers. Today, London has some 3,500 pubs, with a population of 9 million. The golden era of pubs seems to be over. In London, the number of pubs has fallen by almost a quarter over the past 15 years alone. Competition has always been stiff. In the 14th century, the city's administration is forced to intervene.
The tavern signs grew so huge that in London, at any rate, the government had to step in and restrict them. You cannot have an ale sign, a tavern sign, any larger than 2 metres long because they're simply clogging up the roads of London.
Yeast is essential for the production of beer. It's responsible for beer's fermentation. It drives the brewing process. Yet it's not mentioned in the German purity law. Why is that?
The thing about yeast is it's invisible. And in the past, people realised that there must be something going on with the brewing process, but they couldn't explain it. All they knew was that there was this mysterious substance that somehow started the fermentation process and magically made the ingredients turn into beer.
It took Louis Pasteur to establish, in his 1876 Études sur la bière, that yeast is responsible for fermentation. He also recognized the nature of yeast, tiny airborne organisms that are found just about everywhere, on our skin and on fruits and plants, for example.
The beer we drink today is influenced by the yeast cultures of previous centuries. This is why our beer tastes feminine. Yes, really, the brewer's yeast migrated into the beer, and the brewers over century were mostly women.
Like Katharina von Bora, a young woman who learns the brewing tradecraft in a cloister. At the age of 16, she becomes a nun. She later discovers that life behind masonry walls, shielded from the outside world, is not to her liking. After 8 years, she flees with a few fellow sisters to begin a new life somewhere else. She gets married at the age of 26 to the reformer Martin Luther himself. She runs his household and, like all women during this time, brews her own beer, which she serves to her husband and his many guests. Brewing was seen primarily as a woman's job because they also ran the household and cooked for the family. More women than men work in the medieval brew houses, not just as waitresses, but also at the brewing kettles.
It's often thought that women really only enter the workforce in the modern period, in the 20th century. I mean, we know that's not true. What's very interesting, though, is the way in which women, sometimes married to brewers, sometimes the widows of brewers, or just women who had inherited brewing responsibilities, a brewing business from their fathers.
In the Middle Ages, there are also other women who are associated with beer, the so-called beer witches. It's they who are blamed if a beer tastes sour or off. They stand accused of sneaking into the breweries at night in the shape of a cat, or of bathing in the brewing kettles. Of course, these women weren't the cause of the spoiled beer. A few centuries on, Louis Pasteur discovers that uncontrolled fermentations are responsible, but he's unable to offer a solution. This was given by a Danish brewing scientist named Emil Christian Hansen. In 1883, he succeeded for the first time in cultivating yeast under laboratory conditions.
The invention of pure culture yeast is actually the birth of modern brewing science. It's one of the most significant innovations in the long history of brewing. Since then, it's been possible to add yeast in a targeted and controlled manner.
This insight paves the way for industrial-scale beer production. It also means that brewing will become a year-round operation to offset the expenditure for the machines. But year-round brewing presents beer makers with a new set of challenges. In 1807, Munich-based master brewer Gabriel Sedelmeier buys the city's smallest brewery. He steers his establishment, the Spaten Brewery, from strength to strength and turns it into a modern industrial enterprise. But then he gets into financial straits. We love a chilled beer in the summer, the high season for beer. Sedelmeier also achieves his highest revenues during this time. But to make money in the summer, he already needs to make investments in the fall and winter. Sedelmeier's bank grants him a loan on overdraft, a short-term overdraft solution, so that he can maintain liquidity.
It's quite astonishing. I've never thought of beer when I'm checking my bank account, but the fact that I can easily spend money that isn't mine, that I can have an overdraft in my bank account, is actually thanks to beer.
Many bank customers across the world use such overdraft facilities, mostly to borrow smaller amounts. Sedelmeier, on the other hand, manages to close his financing gap thanks to this new line of credit. Upon receiving the loan, Sedelmeier's brewery is able to continue its run of success. Other beer producers pursued more traditional ways to raise capital. In the 19th century, many breweries were converted into joint stock companies. By this time, it was no longer possible to finance industrial brewing from personal assets. Industrial brewers are also confronted with a very practical problem, namely temperatures. Previously, brewing was done in winter. Fermentation is encouraged by heat, but heat also causes beer to spoil more easily. Since only cool temperatures guarantee stable beers, a cooling system needed to be installed during the summer months.
Ice was a big business in the 19th century. There were international companies producing and selling blocks of the stuff. But obviously, it was only really a winter business, and they could only harvest their ice in the few cold months when the water was frozen over. And according to Louis Pasteur's estimations, it required 1 kilogram of ice to brew 1 litre of beer. So the brewers' demand for ice was absolutely huge.
Breweries used ice that was cut from shallow ponds that were able to freeze over quickly in wintertime. But this ice could nowhere near meet the demand, since it was only available for a few months a year. There just wasn't enough of it to last the rest of the year. Another solution was needed. Carl von Linde, an engineer, found this solution. He invented an ammonia compression ice machine, in other words, a huge refrigerator. Sedelmeier didn't hesitate. In 1875, the first ice machine model was put into operation at the Spaten Brewery. Ever since then, brewing has been possible all year round.
Today, refrigerators are part of our everyday lives. But we owe the fact that we can always have a nice cold beer at home to the beer itself. As a driving force of innovation, it also helped launch refrigeration technology.
Another innovation comes to Europe by sea. Christopher Columbus spends 70 days sailing across the Atlantic before he makes landfall in America. The discovery of the New World would not have been possible without long-life beer. In the remote corners of the planet, Europeans not only encounter unknown countries, they also encounter unknown plants, animals, and foods. Two of them, coffee and tea, are destined to become beer's main competitors in Europe.
From the 17th and particularly the 18th century onwards, of course, what you get is alternatives to beer, other forms of non-alcoholic brewing, and coffee arrives, and tea arrives. So you see the arrival in the 17th century of the coffee house.
Magnificent coffee houses spring up in cities throughout Europe. This is where the new bourgeois elites meet. These establishments compete with the breweries, which are no longer the only venues for social gatherings. And gradually, the cityscape begins to change. In practically every country in the world, more coffee is drunk today than beer. And the range of beverages on offer today is virtually limitless. Today's consumers are spoiled for choice when it comes to quenching their thirst.
In the Middle Ages, people were so poor and food was often so hard to come by. Beer was actually a form of meal replacement because, of course, it contains a lot of calories. And so it was, not just a drink of pleasure. It was actually, for some people, a drink of survival.
This changes with Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic. He brings back new food products to Europe. Tomatoes, pumpkins, corn and potatoes became part of the European diet thanks to this explorer from Genoa. Potato soup takes the place of beer in the diet of the lower classes.
This globalization doesn't just see the experience of Europe importing tea and coffee, importing all its drinks. It begins to see in the 19th century the process of export as well. And one of the biggest exports is a new kind of beer, which is going to be exported to India. That's where India Pale Ale comes from.
On the voyage from India to England, the merchant ships carried tea. On their outward journey to the colony, they transported beer. Since this journey takes almost 3 months and traverses all the Earth's climate zones, an especially sturdy beer was needed. For this reason, India Pale Ale is still a particularly strongly hopped beer with a relatively high alcohol content of 7%. IPA is experiencing a renaissance today. Craft beer brewers across the globe are enthusiastic about this beer, which is characterized by a really strong aroma. Another colony also turns into a beer country, the US. But before this could happen, barley, which is not native to this part of the world, had to migrate across the Atlantic. Today, the US is the world's most important industrial nation and second biggest beer producer. Economically successful, the US dominates the world beer market. In the 19th century, a few fearless beer pioneers spark a beer revolution here.
Much of the knowledge of American brewers originally came from Europe, and especially Germany. Back in the 19th century, many German brewers emigrated over to the US and really laid the foundations for the industry. In particular, Eberhard Anheuser and Adolphus Busch were especially important in getting it started.
Busch joins his father-in-law's company and modernizes it. They are the first in the US to introduce pasteurization and refrigeration. But their most important innovation is a new type of beer that they import, namely Pilsner beer. Busch names it Budweiser, after the Czech town where he first tasted it. At the end of the 19th century, small breweries are pushed to the margins. Large corporations begin to dominate the markets, and new classes of customers emerge. The age of industrialization sees the formation of a working class in the big cities. Hundreds of thousands of these workers migrate from the countryside to the urban centers. The beer industry is desperate to win these individuals as customers. But since leisure time to spend at beer gardens and brew houses is rare, the beer must be brought to the workers. So how? At the beginning of the 20th century, fundamental change occurs. Up till then, beer was almost exclusively drunk from earthenware jugs and stored in kegs.
Today, it seems completely normal for us to drink our beer from a glass or a bottle. But you have to realise that glass was an extremely expensive and valuable material for centuries. It was pure luxury and only affordable for kings and rich people. It was present in chandeliers or mirrors in palaces like Versailles. And as a drinking vessel, it was only used by royals and high aristocrats.
It wasn't until 1867 that Friedrich Siemens developed a method to produce glass mechanically. At one stroke, production at the Siemens glass factory in Dresden is increased 66-fold. This heralds the beginning of industrial glass production. Beer brewers are eager to capitalize on this opportunity. Even regular folks can afford a bottle of beer. Kegs, on the other hand, can only be sold to restaurants and pubs. The new glass bottle lets brewers sell beer directly to the beer drinker.
bottled beer also changes the way in which people can consume beer. It enables them to do it at home. It enables them to take it away with them. It enables new forms of social gathering as people bring their bottled beers out and have picnics and parties.
But for beer bottles to become a real success story, one decisive detail still needs to fall into place. Workers like to take their beer to work. Unthinkable today, this used to be common practice. To be able to transport beer in their bag, the bottles had to be tightly sealed and leak-proof. Two inventors made this possible almost instantaneously. In 1875 in Berlin, Karl Dietrich invented the swing stopper, a porcelain cap with a rubber sealing ring. And in 1892, William Painter, an American, applied for a patent for the bottle cap. The beer bottle, as we know it today, could now be launched. But why are beer bottles brown?
Now, the thing is, beer is usually bottled a long time before it's actually consumed. And the trouble is, UV radiation can trigger a chemical reaction in beer, which makes the hops release a bitter substance, which allegedly tastes similar to skunk spray, so definitely not something that you want in your beer. Fortunately, coloured glass is actually very effective at filtering out this radiation, and that's why we usually drink our beer out of brown bottles.
Glass also finds its way into restaurants and private homes. Earthenware jugs disappear almost completely from everyday life. This has the effect of fundamentally changing people's relationship to beer.
When someone puts a glass of freshly tapped beer in front of us, right, we get even thirstier because of the way that it looks. There's something very sensual about not just the taste, but by the color, by the condensation, the coldness. When brewers are making beer, they're not just thinking about the taste, but they're thinking about the idea that we drink with our eyes.
But the perfect beer differs a great deal. There's a lot of disagreement concerning its visual appearance.
Now, of course, the topic of foam is very much a subjective one. Some people love to have a nice thick head on their glass. Others, certainly us Brits, prefer to keep that to a minimum. Personally, if I have a glass of beer, I want the full glass to be filled with it.
German brewers, on the other hand, deliberately generate a lot of foam. As much carbon dioxide as possible is added to the beer to get a large head of foam. And the hops make sure that it lasts a long time. For other beer drinkers, colour is most important. And this too now immediately strikes the eye. Malts, the germinated grains that are subsequently dried, are the biggest influence on a beer's colour. The longer it's been dried, the darker the beer. Higher temperatures also give the beer a darker hue, and colour malt is available to brewers who want to brew red beer, for example. Belgians in particular are fond of coloured beers. In the US and Asia, light varieties such as lager or pilsner are preferred. Lager is a low-alcohol beer.
80% of all Japanese, Chinese and Koreans can only tolerate a little alcohol. Current research suggests that rice is the reason for this. 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, the Chinese fermented it to preserve their harvest. This fermentation process produced alcohol, which they consumed while eating rice. A genetic mutation caused some of them to lack an enzyme that breaks down the alcohol. They couldn't tolerate it and therefore ate less. In the long term, these people lived healthier than those who did not have this natural limit and were consuming more and more alcohol until they died early of liver damage.
And it's not just Asians whose health is impaired. In the early 20th century, beer has a bad reputation due to its negative health effects. The US is founded on immigration. While Germans and the Irish didn't see anything wrong with imbibing in alcohol, puritanical English settlers strictly abstained from it. The Protestant Church had already preached against alcohol consumption in its early days. Martin Luther suggested that alcohol weakens one's vigilance in the fight against the devil. Towards the end of the 19th century, a movement to mobilize against alcohol, the drink of devils, takes shape in America. Bible-abiding citizens consider beer and all other alcoholic beverages to have a harmful effect, not just on the health of those who drink it, but above all on public and social morals. But drinking beer has in fact also the benefit of relieving tension.
There's this crazy story about a plane hijacking back in 1985 where there was this young guy who threatened the pilots of a Norwegian plane with a gun, demanding to speak to the Prime Minister. But one of the police's strategies was to just keep giving him more and more beer so that I guess he would get more relaxed and eventually release the hostages. And when only the crew was left on the plane, then he finally gave up his gun for one last case of beer. So in this instance, beer did save lives.
The main target of the prohibitionists is actually brandy and not beer. But beer moved into their crosshairs during World War I. American troops are facing German soldiers on the battlefields of Europe, and most brewers have German roots, so beer too becomes the enemy. In 1919, a law was passed to prohibit all consumption of alcohol. Beer kegs are smashed and breweries are shuttered. Alcohol is forbidden even today in some parts of the world for religious reasons, especially in Muslim countries including Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, and the United Arab Emirates. But even parts of the United States, the so-called dry counties, still ban the sale of alcohol today. But people often try to sidestep bans. During Prohibition, alcohol is sold in pharmacies for medicinal purposes. So within 10 years, the Walgreens pharmacy chain increases the number of its locations from 20 to 520. Travel on cruise ships become fashionable because drinking is still allowed outside American territorial waters. Cruises to nowhere are in demand. Little bottles of alcohol fit everywhere. A flourishing shadow economy develops. In the so-called speakeasies, beer and schnapps are served with lavish abandon. It's estimated that some 35,000 of these establishments operated throughout the US during the Prohibition era. The rise of Al Capone, a gangster from Chicago, is facilitated by the speakeasies. Indeed, organized crime profits most from the ban on alcohol. While only 7 out of 100,000 Americans die from liver damage, some 10 in 100,000 are murdered. The Prohibition instantly obliterates the business of legal breweries. After August Anheuser-Busch takes over the Budweiser company, he tries to salvage the family enterprise by producing fizzy drinks, baby food, and ice cream.
During the Prohibition, some breweries found a way to sort of stay alive by marketing malt extract or yeast. Now, these products, of course, could be used as a baking ingredient in the kitchen, but they were more often used to actually just homebrew beer. And in fact, breweries often included instructions of what not to do with the extract so that you don't accidentally produce beer.
One of the heirs of the Anheuser-Busch family recently revealed that in the Prohibition era, one of the customers of their yeast business was Al Capone. He told the Anheuser, who was in charge at the time, that he needed more yeast for his illegal brewing.
After a few years, the conviction that Prohibition causes more crime than it prevents also gains ground in politics. In 1933, President Roosevelt repeals the Prohibition Amendment and marks this event by ordering a case of Budweiser. By midnight, breweries such as Anheuser-Busch resume their brewing activities, but only a few of them are still around.
So the brewing industry has to be reawoken, and in that process, what one sees is not just the revival of brewing and not just the revival of these companies, but also intense competition between them as they attempt to use this moment to become the dominant force in American brewing.
The demise of breweries in the US was dramatic and unprecedented the world over. But in Europe too, the beer industry came under pressure from crop failures and the 2 world wars. Smaller breweries in particular were unable to stand their ground. Today, huge corporations dominate the beer industry. The top 10 brewery groups currently supply 2/3 of the world's beer. This also intensifies the competition. Breweries explore new strategies to win and also keep customers. The Irish Guinness Brewery is the first to give its brand recognizability. With the Guinness Harp, they create one of the world's oldest brewery logos. The design is trademarked in 1862. To this day, it features on the labels of Guinness beer bottles. The Guinness Brewery is also one of the first to use paper labels for this purpose. Other breweries follow suit.
Brands and logos shape our world to a large extent. So if you say Guinness, everyone thinks of the harp. If you say Heineken, it's a red star. Carlsberg, that curved green lettering. We're conditioned that way. And a big part of advertising is to make those associations, to have that brand awareness, right?
My goodness!
The advertising industry picks up speed after World War II. Cigarettes and beer feature prominently in the early PR machine.
Open a Budweiser and pour yourself the most inviting glass of beer you've ever tasted.
It's all about conveying a certain way of life and attitude. In the post-war period, especially the Western beer giants embrace freedom and happiness as values to aspire to. Beer companies are now also at the forefront of sponsoring. Football World Championships, the Olympic Games, as well as the Super Bowl are all sponsored by breweries. Spectator numbers are huge, with brands getting massive exposure. This reinforces the clout of major corporations, causing sales figures to skyrocket. Mass production, however, often has a detrimental effect on quality and variety, with some beer drinkers no longer willing to accept this, taking on the beer giants. A craft beer movement has gathered momentum across the globe.
We're all familiar with Pilsner. We know wheat beer and perhaps we've enjoyed a stout in an Irish pub. But that's about it. But there are, and have been, so many different styles of beer. The goal is to revive and to reinterpret some of these, to add other flavors with new hop varieties. That's the fun part, to introduce beer enthusiasts to completely different facets of beer.
Although the sales figures of the new players are nowhere near their major competitors, they found a niche in the beer sector, and they're giving beer enthusiasts a whole new beer drinking experience. The craft beer scene has its roots in the US, and the person who made this possible is Jimmy Carter. The US president probably had no idea what he was about to unleash when he signed a bill in 1978 that legalized home brewing.
Just imagine, the president signs a law and all over the country people go out to buy baker's yeast and small brewing kettles, put them in their cellar or garage and try to brew their own individual beer. Suddenly, you've got a whole new awareness for this drink.
One of the best-known home brewers is a successor to Carter. Barack Obama habitually brewed 3 types of beer, and apparently his palate prefers sweet over bitter. Honey porter and honey ale are 2 of the creations that come from the presidential brewery. From the US, this movement spreads across the world. Craft brewers are primarily keen for new taste experiences. To discover these, they also fall back on beer types that are in part centuries old and have long since gone out of style.
The rich diversity on the beer market vanished in the 20th century. Before that, there were always many different types and regional specialities. Of course, there was no room for them in the product range of the big companies because they didn't generate enough sales, so they disappeared little by little.
The public embrace of sustainability, together with a new health consciousness, is also having an impact on major beer companies. The most visible result is non-alcoholic beers.
These days, we have many non-alcoholic beers, and those are great because, there are people for many reasons that don't want to drink, but they enjoy the taste and the aroma of beer, and so it's a good solution for them.
In the meantime, the share of non-alcoholic beer has reached 5% of the total beer market in Germany, one of the most traditional beer countries. Non-alcoholic beer varieties also achieve high market shares in Asia, where alcohol intolerance is widespread, and the US. So even though the Prohibition failed to prevent drinking alcohol, it did achieve at least one thing. It raised awareness about the harmful effects of alcohol, and in the long term has led to a reduction in alcohol consumption, even among young people. To secure the future of beer, brewers must adapt the centuries-old beverage to the new requirements of the market.
Gluten intolerances are becoming increasingly common. If we look around on an international level, we could drink rice beer from Asia or corn beer from Mexico because there's no gluten in that because the ingredients themselves are gluten-free. But it also tastes quite different from what the Europeans are used to. So in order to create what we'd call a typical beer taste without gluten, there'll just have to be more research.
Beer's march to monopoly may have been halted, but it's still an integral part of our everyday life.
There's no such thing as having a serious beer.
Probably my favourite drink, to be honest.
It's adapting to new circumstances and thus asserting its position as the world's most widespread beverage. Countless types and varieties evolved over the course of 10,000 years. And in recent years, beer has been experiencing a real hype.
The craft beer movement is really exciting, has, in a way, reinvented beer.
For thousands of years, beer has been tasty, refreshes people, and brings them together. Beer will continue to evolve in step with the progress of the times and will remain one of the most popular beverages